mean, every journalist that gets a lucky break should never forget that lucky break, and I am one of them. And this speaks exactly to your question. I was reporting on terrorism uh, in the early 2000s. This is kind of like the, domestic, like DHS was brand new. You're talking about federal agents in a domestic environment. And I was at a dinner party, seated next to an old man, 88 years old, um, who I thought I knew he worked for Lockheed. And I thought he was I imagined him designing like windows for airplanes. And he leaned over to me and said, I've been reading your reporting and have I got a story for you? And, when you're a reporter, you're like, okay. And he said, the CIA just declassified 50 years worth of my life's work. And that makes your head
Really?
spin. And he was the physicist for the very secretive Lockheed Skunk Works, which created stealth technology for the CIA and the Pentagon starting in the 1950s at Area 51. And
Wow.
so, how could you not have a sudden interest? I mean, that was like, you just lean in and say, wow, would you introduce me to your friends? And he did. And that built that first book I wrote, Area 51, which involved 74 people from the intelligence community and the military community that had actually lived and worked at that secret base that everyone thought was, had to do with aliens. And in fact, was a testing facility for uh, CIA spy planes.
Yeah, if somebody opened that door for me to have those conversations, I would be sprinting through that as well.
Yeah. I mean, it was also just so remarkable because, well, first of all, Ed Lovick, that was the physicist, he was in his late 80s and many of his friends were in their 90s. And we're talking about friends that, Ray Gowdy, who but was a barnstormer in between the world wars, and a stunt pilot who actually flew some of the first U-2 flights out at 51. He was still alive and interviewed with me. And people like Hervey Stockman, the first man to fly the U-2 over the Soviet Union in the 50s. All these guys were World War II heroes who had been given this cushy job out at Area 51. And they were remarkable individuals. And they generously shared with me these secret programs because they had just been declassified. This was in 2009. They had just been declassified. And so they had been almost forgotten. And, their family members didn't necessarily want to hear about it, but I did.
I often wish that podcasting was a medium that existed more back then, or even around the time of World War II or the Korean War or even Vietnam War. I feel like there are what you're describing, these people that if they hadn't been given the opportunity, the information largely would have died with them. Just the chance and the opportunity to record those stories would be, I'm glad you had those conversations, but I often wonder what it would have been like if you could have had a similar conversation like we're having now on this medium and transmit it. It would have been a great way to capture some of that
Mhm.
history.
I wonder that same thing. And I always encourage people to, within their own families, because sometimes people say like, oh, my father or my grandfather did this, but I don't really know. And I always say, just get your iPhone, which has a better recording device, by the way, than I had as a young reporter. And I had all the best equipment, but
Yeah.
the iPhone recording device, you just hit the button and ask that old timer family member about their experiences and record them, because you're absolutely right. Especially as people get older, they recognize that when they die, their stories are going to go with them. And the opportunity to speak about it becomes a profound experience.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely want to talk with you a little bit about Area 51 and some of your other works, but I want to talk specifically right now about your most current book, the topic of which not exactly a happy, read this one staring at the sunset type of book. It's a subject matter that largely people would associate with the end of the world. I'm talking about nuclear war. How did that one get your attention? Why did you decide to write a book on this particular
Mhm.
topic?
So imagine me writing before nuclear war. I'd written 6 books, all of which deal with some of the things we're talking about, and these,
Mhm.
individuals who have fought in every war since World War II, operated under extreme duress in very violent environments, often paramilitary, because of course I've written books about the CIA's paramilitary, which is not the military. Um, and often I would ask my sources, particularly when we would come to areas that some people might say are morally questionable, I would say, why did you do what you did? And a common
Hmm.
answer was to prevent nuclear World War III. And every one of my books crosses with nuclear operations. And so in the first Trump administration, during those fire and fury rhetoric days, um, I wondered what would happen if prevention of nuclear World War III failed and we actually had a nuclear war. And when COVID happened, I, like many people around the world, found themselves with a little extra time and a Zoom platform, which really,
Yep.
did not exist before. And someone that I was working with suggested to me that the generals, the nuclear command and control folks, might have a little more time for me than they normally would. And that is precisely what happened. And so the sources that I have in nuclear war scenario, which for readers to know, I list right up front in the book, as opposed to the standard way of journalism, you list your sources in the back. I wanted readers to know how deeply sourced this book was, how I spoke to individuals like former secretaries of defense, former commander of Stratcom, of the nuclear submarine forces, Obama's FEMA director, Obama's top nuclear advisor. I wanted people to realize that although I was writing a scenario, I had learned through these interviews during COVID what would happen if deterrence failed. And that is the result of the book.
Ladies and gentlemen, hot salt from Firecracker Farm is the real deal.